Hello, welcome to my brand new YouTube channel. I'm Vlada and this is Gordon. I run a meetup group here in New York where we get together to discuss current political and social issues and engage in the occasional very heated philosophical debate. And I just decided to try out a YouTube channel as a fun way to think through and summarize my ideas on whatever topic I find interesting at the time. So today we're going to be reviewing Joe Biden's student debt relief plan. Now let's get into it. Time to spit facts and logic. As I'm sure you've seen, a few weeks ago, Biden announced a plan for partial student loan forgiveness. The plan will reduce federal student loan debt by up to $10,000 or for Pell Grant recipients by up to $20,000 for any borrowers currently making less than $125,000 a year or a $250,000 family income. So far, I've seen many people praising this move as a step in the right direction, while others feel it doesn't do nearly enough. And then there are those who, like me, find a lot to criticize. Now, my problem with this plan is not just that it's unfair, but that it seems like a very inefficient use of funds, especially from a leftist perspective. And I saw this Instagram post from AOC that was directed to critics of the plan, where she suggested that they just need to reject the scarcity mindset. And I just really feel that comments like that fail to grapple with the opportunity costs that are associated with a plan like this. This isn't to say that I don't think there are any problems with student loan debt. In fact, I think there's way too much student loan debt being handed out, and it can feel almost predatory to be offering such massive amounts of debt to young people, particularly for students who are pursuing disciplines that are unlikely to result in highly compensated employment after college. Now, for those students who come from families that cannot afford an expensive education but who show immense promise in any given field, they should have access to tuition discounts and grants that allow them to attend. And many already do, which we'll discuss in a little bit. But otherwise, the right decision might be to not attend that very expensive school. Now, I agree that it's unfair to have certain prestigious schools less available to lower and middle income students. But I just don't think that unfairness can be ameliorated by allowing students to take on an unreasonable amount of debt. Absent of effectively unlimited funds, I think we should be coaching young people to view their education as an investment and to not spend more on it than they think that it will return for them, both in terms of financial and subjective well-being. I understand that this view can sound harsh to people, especially from my generation. I'm a millennial and younger, because many of us have been told our whole lives to follow our dreams and the rest will follow. But honestly, telling the average young person to just follow their dreams is pretty insane advice. I feel like people expressing frustration with this plan have been accused of simply wanting others to suffer because they suffered earlier, or as AOC said, of having a scarcity mindset. But the reason that people are frustrated is because it feels very arbitrary in terms of who this plan benefits and who it leaves out, and it fails to account for different life choices. I think of the student who graduated with debt and chose to live with a family member in the suburbs while commuting to the city for work so that they could pay down their debt quickly, versus their classmate who chose to live in an expensive apartment and only meet the minimum payments. Both choices are totally valid, but it doesn't seem right that one person in that situation gets $10,000 and the other one doesn't. Or I think of the student who got into Yale but chose to go to UConn because they got a full ride. Is it fair that this plan leaves that student out? And on top of that, why not bail out young people burdened by other forms of debt? It just feels incredibly random or incredibly politically motivated to hone in just on this particular group of debt holders. So who is this plan really helping?
Look, here's the deal.
Oh my God, Brandon, chill. In 2015 to 2016, which is the most recent data I found from the National Center for Education Statistics, only 12% of student loan dollars went to dependent students from low-income families. In this case, low income is defined as up to the 25th percentile, middle income as the 25th to 75th percentile, and high income as above the 75th percentile. Now, 24% of those loan dollars went to students who were independents, and they were not broken out by income, so I can't speak to that portion. But among dependent borrowers, students from low-income families were underrepresented, while students from high-income families were actually overrepresented. On top of the family situation that you come from, people with a college degree can also expect to bring in significantly higher incomes. In 2021, people with a bachelor's degree earned about $27,000 more annually than people with only a high school diploma. And on top of that, they also faced a significantly lower unemployment rate. So I just don't see a good reason why we should, in particular, be paying off debt for relatively high earners from relatively well-off backgrounds. And I find this even more interesting given the current political and social moment that we're in, where there's such an intense focus on identity and privilege. Now, I want to discuss the related issue of the cost of college, because the reality is that very few students actually pay the price that you'll see quoted on a university's website. In the 2020 to 2021 school year, the average net cost of attendance paid by students at four-year nonprofit private universities was $33,000 versus a $56,000 sticker price. For public four-year colleges, that was $19,000 versus a $27,000 sticker price. And since 2006, which is the start point of the data that I'm looking at, the inflation-adjusted cost of attendance has gone up only very modestly for both public and private schools, while the published cost has gone up more significantly. And this is possible because over this period, grants per student have roughly doubled. So at private colleges, they've gone up from $13,000 to $23,000 on average per student, and from just over $4,000 to just over $8,000 at public schools. And not to go off on another tangent, but I do think it's worth spending just a minute on how college enrollment and tuition costs are determined. It's important to understand that expected revenues are a part of the admissions process, and for good reason. Universities need to be able to plan out their budgets for the year, and student revenues are often an important piece of that. What this effectively means is that universities need to let in enough students from well-off families that are able to pay full price and who are likely to accept their offer. These students effectively subsidize other students who can't pay full price or who are academically gifted or in some other way benefit the university's reputation. If you want to know more about this, I suggest checking out this New York Times interview with Angel Perez, who oversees admissions at Trinity College. Near the end of the piece, they talk about these financial aid optimization consultants that many universities hire. These consultants attempt to model the probability that a given student will accept an offer with X amount of tuition discounts based on various demographic and academic attributes. They use this to predict the expected revenues for the university with a given set of admissions letters. This quote on the complexity of the tuition, admissions, and budgeting process explains it well. The discounts they offer vary widely from student to student. In fact, if you pick any two freshmen at the same college, they are very likely to be paying completely different tuition rates. Those rates are based not on the true value of the service the college is offering or even on the ability of the student's family to pay. Instead, they are based on a complex calculation using sophisticated predictive algorithms of what the student is worth to the college and what the college is worth to the student. The last thing I want to discuss is the criticisms I've heard of elite universities with large endowments. The example that I'm thinking of comes from a Sam Harris podcast in the spring of 2020 where he had Caitlin Flanagan on. And during the episode, both he and Caitlin criticized Harvard extremely harshly for laying off some cafeteria and other workers during the pandemic when the campus was shut down. Here's the clip.
On that note, another ethical issue that leapt out of the newspaper to me a couple days ago. This is now to the omnipresent COVID discussion. Did you see that Harvard and Princeton are laying people off? Harvard's endowment, I think, is $40 billion. Mm-hmm. Princeton is like $29 billion or something close to that. I mean, basically, these two colleges have almost as much money as Apple and Google. I mean, how is this not just a brand-destroying scandal?
I think what Sam said there is totally ridiculous, especially for someone who's normally very careful with his arguments. And to explain why, let's just step back for a second and talk about what an endowment is. In the university context, the purpose of an endowment is to support the university's mission in perpetuity. And so the endowment is meant to be managed in such a way that it would be able to support the same level of services at any point in the future as it does today. The investment office that manages the endowment is tasked with investing it such that the university will be able to take a relatively stable distribution from it every single year to spend on services for the university, such as tuition discounts, for example, and that the remaining assets will at least keep up with inflation over time. So a goal that you'll often hear discussed in the industry is CPI plus 5, which is sort of the standard starting point, meaning you can spend 5% of the value of your endowment per year, and the remaining assets will keep their purchasing power over time. Endowments are also governed in the US by the Uniform Prudential Management of Institutional Funds Act, which has been adopted in virtually every state. Under this legislation, spending in excess of 7% is considered imprudent by default. And what that means is that if Harvard wanted to spend above that 7% rate, their board would have to be able to make a case that that spending was prudent, where prudent has a specific definition. One of the requirements for spending to be considered prudent is that it has to take into account the purposes of the charity and the fund. Now, I said earlier that the purpose of an endowment in the university context is to support their mission. And at Harvard, that mission is to advance new ideas and promote enduring knowledge. And frankly, I think it would be pretty difficult to make a case that keeping low-income workers that you didn't need on the payroll was somehow in line with that mission. Now, to be clear, I definitely think that these workers deserved a safety net at the onset of COVID, but it just doesn't follow that that support should be coming specifically from Harvard's endowment. I also think that people likely underestimate the degree to which universities with large endowments already use them to support things like student aid. At Harvard, for example, the subject of Sam's ire in that podcast clip, they covered 49% of their 2021 operating budget through philanthropic income. Student revenues, on the other hand, only accounted for 17% of that operating budget. And looking at other elite universities with large endowments like Yale and Princeton, the numbers are directionally similar, but with an even lower percent of their revenues coming from student income at roughly 6% each. Now, these operating budget support numbers are not the norm at your typical university that doesn't have a massive endowment. In that article on Trinity that I mentioned before, they estimate that roughly 2/3 of Trinity's operating budget comes from student revenues. But the reason I bring them up is that the universities that I often hear maligned for the size of their endowments are already using them to substantially reduce costs at the university. I know that I went off on a couple of different tangents, but the point that I'm making is that the group of people this plan benefits feels very arbitrary. They aren't the most in need, and it just doesn't seem like a valuable or efficient way to redistribute funds. Personally, I do believe that there should be some reasonable safety net for people who are not able to meaningfully participate in the economy. But paying off debt of mostly middle-income people with high earning potential, and then excluding the subset of that group that made tough personal and financial decisions in order to get out of debt, seems to be more driven by political salience and flashy headlines than it is societal benefits. So with that, I'll end it here. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope to be back soon.